Welcome to the Anthrozoology podcast, episode 6, part 2 with Hal Herzog. So how old's Tilly?
How's Tilly?
How old is she?
Oh, how old is she? She's about 11 years old now. She's doing good.
So she's an outdoor cat. She likes to go for a little wander, does she?
So today I gave her she calls the shots. So she came over and told me she wanted her breakfast and to go outside. I said, no, you really don't want to go outside because there's 6 inches of snow out there, but she wanted to go outside. So she looked at me and meowed, told me she wanted to go outside. So I went over there, opened the door. She took one look outside, put one foot on the snow, and then turned around and went back and jumped in her chair. So
they listen to us when we tell them, right? The kids.
So my research, I'm looking at cat-human relations and some of the discourses surrounding free-roaming cats, and it's really intriguing, the different attitudes and how some people think that you're a terrible person if you let your cat outside. Others think that you're a terrible person if you keep your cat imprisoned, and most people are more nuanced than that. But there's some real passion going on, and even amongst people that care about cats, cat lovers, there's
I know, yeah. I know that if I was a better person, I would make Tilly stay inside all the time. But I also know that if I were Tilly, I would rather go outside when I wanted to go outside. So to me, this is a really interesting issue. There also seems to be some national differences in that, attitudes towards keeping cats indoors and outdoors. But I mean, it's pretty, from an environmental point of view, there's no question about it that cats are a threat. They're part of the problem. So I'm not going to make that argument. For a cat, I'd rather be my cat than my friend Michael Delgado's cat. She's a cat researcher. Her cats stay inside all the time. Did you ask about the Anthropocene? Is that correct?
Yes, the cats seem to get the blame for a lot of killing, but we don't. Yeah. The Anthropocene doesn't appear in your book. I couldn't find it anyway. I was interested to know why.
Because some of that stuff, I wrote that. I basically did most of the writing in that book in 2008. So that was before the Anthropocene was being tossed around so much. I think we're screwed. That's what my inner lawyer says. My inner lawyer says we're screwed when it comes to the Anthropocene. Now, we have wiped out. We have one species that is basically has been the equivalent of the meteor that hit the Earth, 60 million years ago and wiped out the dinosaurs and most things. So that's what we're doing. And I'm not seeing anything to make a dent in that. And meat's a good example. So is meat consumption worldwide going down? No, it's going up tremendously. Even in the United States, with all this talk about, I can go to my store and I can buy vegan, and my grocery store and buy vegan food, and more and more people are going vegan. It's mostly vegetarian. It's mostly not true that meat consumption in the United States has, since Peter Singer wrote Animal Liberation, per capita meat consumption has gone from about 170 pounds of meat per capita per person to about 240. And it's percentage of Americans that eat meat are not going down. Most vegetarians eat meat every day. Every day. Studies have found this. So the hypocrisy associated with meat eating is the most stunning thing about meat eating. A recent study found that many vegetarians eat fish. Most of them they delude themselves into thinking that fish are not meat. So there you go. The cat issue is interesting, because to me that's the most morally complex issue, because I have a cat and I let my cat go outside. And I know she goes outside and she kills little things. And I compare owning a cat that goes outside to meat eating. Like, I eat meat, even though I know it's bad for the environment and stuff like that. I eat less of it than I used to. I try and get meat that's humanely raised and stuff like that. Why do I eat meat?
Yeah.
I eat meat because it tastes good. That's my only defense. It's a terrible defense. Why do I have a cat? I have a cat for the same reason I eat meat. It's because she gives me pleasure. And I know that by letting her outside, she takes a toll on the environment. And just like my meat eating practice, my meat eating habits takes a toll on the environment. So to me, keeping a pet and eating meat raise the same moral issues. And if you look at the meat consumed by our pets, it's quite stunning. So so to me, this pet keeping is one of the most interesting moral issues right now, because the more I think about it, the more I think we should not keep pets. I'm not getting rid of my cat. I've always had pets. I'm going to keep it. But when I look at the morality of imprisoning animals in our homes because we want them to be our pals, and if I were to come back I argue in my book that if I were to come back as a chicken, I'd much rather be a gamecock than I would a McDonald's chicken.
Yeah.
Well, if I was going to come back as a dog, I would not want to be a pet in your house or my house. I'd rather be a street dog in Mexico City or on the island of Tobago. Yeah. They get to call their own shots.
I mean, you say in your book that you don't want to change the minds of people, but convince them to think more deeply. However, for example, if people read articles that say such a thing, for example, why do we cut the balls off dogs, or we're taking away the agency of animals to reproduce, etc. Sometimes those things kind of creep out, or quite often they creep out, and they can affect trap neuter release programs in countries where animals actually suffer because there is no trap neuter release. So even though, so I kind of wanted to understand whether you saw your work as activism for a couple of reasons. One, if you don't, how do you deal with the knock-on effects of something that you publish because you're obviously so well known? And secondly, if you do see it as activism, that's something us three are interested in, and we're interested in trying to understand how you think the most effective way is of changing people's perspectives and behavior, et cetera, et cetera. So interested to know your thoughts.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And so question is, why do I do research? Why do I do the studies that I do? And there is a reason that I do the things that I do. And it's, for the most part, I find them fun and interesting. And that's true. It's like, I don't want to do things that I've done projects that were not fun and interesting. I didn't like them as much. So I do not consider myself an activist. I find activism and science how can I put it? It can be problematic when you bring your political, and I'm seeing this happen now in some areas in the field, when people are bringing their political agendas into their research. Can we trust their research? And so to me, I'm not agnostic on these issues. I have opinions, but for the most part, I'm motivated by projects that I find fun, and one of the things is that I did do a project. Scott Plouse and I, social psychologists, did a project where we did have a political agenda, and I'll tell you what the project was. And I describe it in my book. It was the project that we did on whether animal care committees can make good judgments, whether university animal care committees can make good judgments about the use of animals in research. Can they accurately and reliably evaluate proposals for use of animals in sometimes harmful studies? We spent 3 years on that. We spent a couple $100,000 in National Science Foundation money. What we found was that we found was important. We found that these committees were terrible at making consistent decisions. We thought we had a really important message there, that we need to have real serious reform in ways that animal care and use committees, use of animals in science, do their jobs. And there's ways that we could possibly make their decisions better. And that paper had no impact at all. We were so, and we published a paper in Science, you know, the world's most prestigious, you know, journal, you know. So it's a good paper. And I was so disheartened by that. The fact that you know, government agencies did not take that seriously and institute things to make these things better. That's one reason why I wrote the book that I did. I'm not a natural book writer. I never wanted to write a book. I thought, you know, if I'm going to work this hard and do a study which has little, if any, impact, you know, I'd like to be able to reach more people. And maybe a way to reach more people would be to write a trade book, not oriented towards scientists, not oriented toward researchers. And that's why I wound up writing Some We Love, Some We Hate, Some We Eat. It was my reaction to working really, really, really hard, hundreds and thousands of hours on a project that did have ethical significance and then had no impact.
Interestingly, I mean, we use your book at Beacon. I know they use the book at Carroll College. We use it in our Introduction to Anthrozoology classes because it is such a good brain experiment. You know, all these stories that you tell in the book really are good jumping off points for getting people to think about their feelings about animals. And this next generation of anthrozoologists that we're now training, since there are undergraduate programs, I think are entering anthrozoology with a bit of a different mental, a different mindset than maybe the original founders of anthrozoology felt, because I do feel like a lot of the undergraduates and us as well, our PhDs in anthrozoology, are very much more leaning toward the activism side of things, that not necessarily that our research is in activism, but just that we're hoping that our research makes an impact in the promotion of positive relationships or makes an impact in the welfare of animals. So have you seen a sort of a natural progression, a swing back toward maybe anthrozoology, this new generation of anthrozoologists taking on more of a advocacy role and maybe a joining of critical animal studies and anthrozoology, or do you think there'll always be that gap with that activism side of things?
I'm not sure. I mean, you know, as I mentioned, I am uncomfortable with that aspect of it. With my book, interestingly enough, I did not write. I'm surprised that my book is being used in. I wrote my book to entertain people, for people that are getting on airplane rides and just want a good read. You know, that was my main goal. The fact that it has had an impact on the field is still a surprise to me. And by the way, I just sent in the new edition to my publisher last week, so there's going to be a new edition coming out.
Oh, good. Yeah, it's just great at it introduces questions that I think a lot of the students never thought to think about.
And one of the things that's interesting one of my goals was, as a teacher, one of my goals was to confuse students. And so I wanted the students to come into class thinking one thing and then leave class not knowing what they think. And so, you know, because I knew that they're going to forget everything. You know, any lecture you give is going to be forgotten in 6 months. But if I could get them to think about something interesting that they would talk to their friends about it at lunch, that was much more important to me. And I wrote the book with the same thing in mind. It was, you know, I want the reader to every page want to turn the next page to say, wow, I never thought of it quite like that. And interestingly, I get emails from readers. I still get frequent emails from readers that are like, when it comes to like eating meat, it's interesting. About half the people I hear from related to that issue, about half of them tell me that you know, they read my book and that they stopped eating meat after that, and another half tell me that they read my book and they were vegetarian and they started eating meat. So my feeling was good. You know, I'm not. I would rather do that than have everybody tell me that they quit eating meat. You know. So that's the difference between me and you know, Melanie Joy. You know, it's like she's an activist. I'm not.
That's
what I read your book right at the beginning of my Anthrozoology journal before I'd sort of really read any academic pieces. And yeah, no, I really enjoyed it as just like sit in my bed and read book.
Good.
And I was looking back over it again sort of last week, and I was really struck. It was the last page where you talk more about the moral inconsistencies, and this is something that I struggle with myself. I've been a lifelong vegetarian. That's never been a problem with me. But recently I wouldn't call myself a vegan. At times I have said that I'm a vegan, but I'm really bad at it. And I guess nobody is the perfect vegan, but I really struggle with this. I kind of have a lot of issues with the dairy industry, particularly, and also egg production and various. So I have issues, but then I do tend to put my head in the sand and just live my life. And I guess that's something that everybody really struggles with. But and I think that's something as anthrozoologists that we can sort of really address and recognize our own faults. So I mean, I feel like I should be vegan, but I'm not. And
well, I see that. I think that's the difference between you and most people, because most people don't worry about that at all. And I think that's part of the moral burden that comes with clarity. When once you get moral clarity in your life, in some ways your life gets screwed up, because then things that you have to think about things that other people don't have to think about. And so the trick is, I guess the message of my book, if I have any message, it's like, don't drive yourself crazy, which is pretty easy to do sometimes. And one of the things the thing, I guess, we all have our good and bad points. And I think one of my good points is that I really like animal people, and I have enormous respect for them, including animal activists. And I have this enormous respect for people that have this sense of moral clarity, that stop eating meat, that become vegans and stuff like that. I don't have that. I'm not like that. And however, I have enormous respect for it. But I also had enormous respect for the cockfighters that I was studying. And I studied circus animal trainers. I didn't write about them in my book, but of any group of people that I found the most interesting, the most morally complex, were the dozens of circus animal trainers that I hung out with and interviewed. And their interactions with animals was so deep. Their knowledge of animals was so, was much greater than any PhD in animal behavior that I ever met, including myself. So, I had this broad frame of, take me to a dog show, and I'm going to love talking to the people that have these dogs that I think are genetic freaks, but I admire your passion for these animals. So.
I ran into kind of the same issue in Nepal, because I studied the owners, the elephant owners, along with the mahouts and along with the elephant advocates or activists. And I did run into a lot of trouble by interviewing the owners and knowing the owners and spending time with elephant owners. I ran into that sense of, oh, how dare you interview people who own animals, and how dare you, give them equal coverage in my book. And I actually had someone, or in my thesis, I actually had someone withdraw from my thesis because I was actually fairly representing the elephant owners as well. And they didn't feel like that was ethically correct. And so, yeah, it is an interesting.
Right. And see, that's exactly my problem with mixing activism and scholarship. And I understand where you're coming from, because I've gotten some of that myself, but not very much, because people generally sort of know where I'm coming from. But I interviewed elephant trainers, circus animal trainers, and I was the couple that I interviewed. I was really blown away by them in some ways, and I could. I do not defend it. I think it's time to close down circus animal acts. There's no question about it, especially elephant acts. But on the other hand, I thought that they had a relationship with these animals that was so deep that I wasn't even able to write about it because I didn't feel like I could do their worlds justice, you know.
I actually found it really encouraging to hear you say that you do research because you enjoy it, because I enjoy research and I enjoy writing papers, but on the other hand, I want my work to be meaningful. I mean, nobody wants to do something that's pointless. So I kind of struggle with this balance of I do enjoy it. I do research because I enjoy it and I want to enjoy it, but at the same time, I feel this immense pressure that I should also focus solely on things that will have an impact. And sometimes I find myself, well, this is just an intellectual exercise. Should I go there? And it's a balance that I struggle with.
Well, you know, when I say I do things just for fun, that's not completely true. Like I agree with you. I mean, one of the reasons why I wrote that book, which made my life really, really miserable for a year, was that I felt like I'd published a lot of research, but I didn't feel like it was making enough impact. And so my feeling was, if I really want to have some impact, I shouldn't be talking to a bunch of college professors. You know, the average research paper is read by hardly anyone, except maybe your mom. You know, and I thought, well, I'll give it a shot to try and write a book that may have some impact. So and if it's going to have some impact, it's got to be written in a way that's really, really interesting. And somehow I got to figure out how to learn to rewrite. I can't write the way I write in a journal to write a book that's going to be read by people. So I agree with you. You do want to feel like your work has some impact. And I was at a point in my career that I felt like, all right, I've already written a bunch of research articles and published a bunch of papers and stuff like that. They haven't had as much impact as I would have liked. So, you know, when I sort of said, well, I only do things that are fun. That was a lie.
I wondered because so obviously we all chose our PhD projects because we were passionate about whatever it is we're doing our PhD projects about. But you're right. I mean, the last 6 months of trying to change my style of writing to fit what is expected for a PhD thesis is, of course, not at all fun. The research part is so lovely and wonderful, and the fitting into someone else's mold is not lovely and wonderful. So I think you're right. I think we need to remember that fun part as we're doing the portal.
So I wrote that book and it's had some impact. One of the things I wound up doing when I first wrote the book, I wound up writing a blog for Psychology Today magazine. And that to me has turned out to be, I did not want to do that. And I was standard academic, like, why would I write a blog? You know, that's for people that need a life, that turned out to be an incredible amount of fun because I can write whatever I want to write about that just strikes me for the moment. And I use it to promote research that I think gets ignored. I use it to promote research by younger, people that are up and coming in the field whose work I think is really good. I write about things that I think are weird and fun.
I wanted to just go back to what you were saying about don't drive yourself mad, and a little bit about the meat eating, people flip-flopping between others, from one to the other. One of my first questions was, you mentioned people going from one stance to the other, but I wondered if there are any longitudinal studies between somebody eventually becoming a vegan or a vegetarian, but there's like a zigzag way of getting there. Maybe change is not quite so easy to do in one fell swoop. And the other thing I wanted to ask is, what does your inner lawyer say about the Anthropocene, please?
Oh gosh. Okay. So let's take those two questions. There's some areas that in the last 10 years, since I wrote the first edition of the book, that have just taken off. And one of them is the study of why people become vegetarians and veganisms and stuff like that. And the literature on that has just become incredibly rich. There's a bunch of social psychologists and food psychologists that have just gotten into this. And so, for example, they publish a lot in the journal Appetite. They don't publish in Anthrozoology, they publish in Appetite. And so there's just a huge amount of stuff coming out now about why people give up meat, why they go back eating, why they go back And there are now longitudinal studies that have looked at that back and forth thing that you're talking about. To me, the issue of eating animals is probably the psychologically most interesting. It's certainly the most morally important. Everything pales in comparison. If you look at animal suffering, there's nothing that's the ocean. That's the ocean. 10 billion animals killed a year because they taste good. So circus animals, zoos, stuff like that, they're a drop in the bucket compared to eating animals. It's also the most morally complex. The fact is that 70% of vegans go back to eating meat, as do 85% of vegetarians. So to me, to make a bad pun, it's so delicious psychologically because we have this conflict between mind and body. We have this conflict between mind and body. We have this conflict between our evolutionary proclivities and our moral sense that no other animal has to experience. And so to me, the issue of meat is, I could spend a lifetime, a career studying that. So that's like it. I don't have any. There's the researchers that are in that area now are quite good, I'd like to see them get involved. I'd like to see them get involved more in the world of anthrozoology. Pet keeping. We basically have these prisoners in our house.
So what do you think about in vitro meat being fed, basically take it, so we don't have to any longer have a sentient being, now we can still keep,
I am a huge fan of in vitro meat. And what's interesting to me, I love the idea that if it tastes good, I'm there, man. I am absolutely there. To me, the interesting things when I've talked to some of my vegan friends about in vitro meat, they're opposed to it. And I'm thinking, like, wait a minute, man, we can save 10 billion animals a year by making meat in great giant vats in New Jersey. What's wrong with that? And they don't really have an answer, but I am puzzled by the fact that so many vegans and vegetarians are opposed to in vitro meat, when to me it's such a no-brainer.
Would you give up animal meat if there was in vitro meat then, or would it still depend on the taste?
In a New York second, if it tasted good, yeah. I would love to.
That'd be an interesting study to see how many people would and what reasons, and as you say, the vegans.
There have been studies on that. Yeah,
okay.
there have been some studies on that. Yeah.
And would most people give up animal meat?
I don't know that literature right now. I've seen the studies, but I don't have the statistics right on the top of my head. I know that a substantial number of vegans are opposed to in vitro meat.
Yeah.
And I remember I talking to a class one time. I was a visiting scholar at a university. I talked to a class, and the woman that was the instructor is a vegan, and we got in an argument in front of the class about in vitro meat. And I was saying, like, hey man, this is great. This is going to be great. She said no, she wasn't having it. I said, well, why are you opposed to it? She said, well, it's going to be based on animal stem cells taken from cows. And I said, like, all right, so what? We kill a few cows to save, 10 billion. I'm not even sure we need to kill a few cows, to save 10 billion animals a year. To me, the moral calculus is pretty clear.
Well, it's interesting to me that one of the issues I had when I first entered the field of anthrozoology is that I was a failed vegetarian. I was a vegetarian for 20 years and went back to eating chicken about 10 years ago. And when I entered the field of anthrozoology and I went to Exeter for a conference, it was all completely vegan food, which is great, except that my daughter, who was also an anthrozoologist, has allergies. And so, of course, everything they were serving, she was unable to eat. And so we went to the market, and both of us at that point were vegetarian, but eating dairy. And when we brought back sandwiches with cheese in it, we were actually vilified at this at this conference because, you know, it was supposed to be a vegan conference. And the consideration, I think, in the UK of anthrozoology is that you must be a vegan activist to be an anthrozoologist. Whereas I feel like in the US, with Canisius and with our program at Beacon, and I'm not sure about Carol, I feel like there's a lot more of a focus on other parts of anthrozoology. Whereas I feel like in the UK, there's much more of a focus on animal rights and welfare. Do you have a take on that? Any thoughts?
No, I don't really. I mean, anthrozoology was started in the UK. It developed for a meeting at, I forgot what university it was, in the early 1990s, late 1980s. And amongst those people were, you know, John Bradshaw was there, James Serpell was there, Dennis Turner was there, Lynette and Ben Hart were there. So it was like 7 people that founded the organization, and it was in the UK. And none of them were vegan or vegetarian, as far as I know. So the roots of the organization were certainly not in animal activism per se. It was in the study of, you know, relationships between people and animals. The anthrozoology, the ISAS conferences that I've been to have not been all vegan for sure. I have been to conferences that have been all vegan, but they were not ISAS conferences.
Yeah, it just surprised me that there's such a difference in, you know, a lot of the UK programs focus a lot more on the theory, on Foucault and you know, the theory side of things, whereas here in the US, I feel like we're focused more on the animal-assisted therapy, animal-assisted intervention, which frankly, I feel like is much too focused on. I feel like we really need to swing more toward the larger body of human-animal relationships. But yeah, it did surprise me.
As I said before, I am suspicious of the combining activism with scholarship, and I know other people agree. And I you know, it's just an area of disagreement. I mean, there's some terrific scholars that are also activists. Now, I remember my own. Ken Shapiro is a psychologist who founded years ago, 20, 30 years ago, Psychologists for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, and I put on a symposium at this is, I don't know, you know, back in the late 80s. I put on organized a symposium at a psychology conference on the psychology of animal activism. And I invited Ken to come down and be a speaker. And so, you know, Ken gave a talk, and our symposium was well received. Well, afterward, Ken and I were having a beer in the hotel bar, and he looked at me. He said, "Hal, how come you're not like us?" And he said, look, you know stuff more than most of us do. You read Singer, you've read Regan, you know, you studied animal activists, you know all the logic, you know we're right about this stuff. How come you're not like us? How come you're not an activist? That's sort of an interesting question, because a lot of animal activists believe that if everybody only knew the truth about the misuse of animals, everybody would quit giving up meat. You know, everybody would become an activist. And I'm living proof that that's not true. And I've thought about that question ever since. Like, why am I not an animal activist, seeing that I do know all this stuff? And there's a couple of possible reasons. One is that I'm a bad person, and I don't like to think that. But another one is that I'm the rule, not the exception. That I'm just an average Joe, as it were. And more people are like me than are like Ken or you know, my friends that are vegans that I have enormous respect for. And there's a piece of me that wishes I was more like them. But on the other hand, I'm not burdened with feeling guilty every time I walk past the meat department in the grocery store. You know, so. You
mentioned in your book that do you think it's one of the non-attitudes or vacuous attitudes that you mentioned in your book, having that kind of
Yes.
laissez-faire attitude towards it?
Yes, and I'm not a good example of that because I do know this stuff, but I think for the average person does not spend a lot of time thinking about, the ethics of eating meat. And so you get these weird things. So my argument, psychologists, if you were to ask psychologists what are the most important principles in psychology, one of the things that they would probably say is cognitive dissonance, that people have trouble maintaining two conflicting ideas at the same time in their head, and they strive to move their behavior in concert with their ideals. Well, I think that's the most overrated principle in psychology, because I think people are living bundles of moral inconsistency. So, I mentioned in the book these studies that if you pollsters call people up and say, do you think animals should have the same rights as people? Like 60% of Americans say yes. Well, probably 97 or 98% of people eat animals. Well, you can't at the same time, there's no logic by which you can say animals should have the same right as humans to live and be happy, and at the same right, eat them for lunch every day. You just can't do it. Most people, that doesn't bother them at all. So, people that are vegetarians and vegans, for ethical reasons, they're the rare exceptions rather than the rule. So
you don't think moral shock really works for many people then?
No, I don't think so. In fact, there was just a study. It works for some people. And when I was doing my first studies, one of my first studies after I studied the psychology of rooster fighters, I studied the psychology of animal rights activists. And so I interviewed animal rights activists, and I found that for a lot of them, moral shock was a big deal. And seeing a picture, I remember one woman, she started crying during our interview when she described the famous PETA poster, which shows Paul the monkey sort of in a, you've probably seen that picture, sort of almost crucified in a restraining cage. And she started crying during the interview. And another guy told me that, I think I read this book, another guy told me it's like, his life was going along just fine. His mother gave him a copy of Animal Agenda to read before he got on an airplane. He started reading it. The stewardess, the flight attendant came by and offered him a turkey sandwich, and he couldn't eat it. And he hasn't eaten meat since. So I think for some people, moral shock is a really big deal. But the Faunanalytics, an organization I really support, they used to be called the Humane Research Council. They do a lot of, they're animal activists that do really good research. They recently ran a study where they gave people, gross pictures of animal abuse and stuff like that, compared to other forms of trying to convince people to change their attitudes. And they found that for the most part, the sort of animal rights pornography, in terms of the pictures of animal suffering, that did not create long-term changes in attitudes. It does for some people, but it's certainly not for everybody. Not for most people.
Interesting.
It was I was chatting with Manoj Gautam from Jane Goodall Institute, Nepal, and he actually used the term misery pimping. I like that term. I mean, that's exactly what it is. It's misery pimping when we use these images to try to create that moral shock, which doesn't always work. It doesn't have lasting effects.
Well, as I mentioned, I do put a premium on fun in my work and my life, and for better or for worse. And at one time when I was studying animal activists, I went to a fair number of animal rights conferences, and most of the time they weren't that fun because of the images, the frequent images of just animal abuse and animal suffering. People just had this moral sense of heaviness. You know what I mean? It's like if you go to these places. On the other hand, I'd go to ISAS meeting, or I'd go to Animal Behavior Society meetings. No, we're going to go out and drink beer this night. You want to go with us? They're not. They're talking about the research and stuff like that, but there wasn't this moral cloud hanging over it. And again, at the animal rights meeting, sometimes people would, do talks on things like, animal rights art and things like that, animal activism art. And it's really, very, very depressing. And sort of put a pall over over conferences.
But so what gives you moral shock? Anything, not necessarily animals, anything at all?
Yeah, it's interesting. There's a lot of things that give me moral shock. A lot of things, but they're not related to animals. Sorry. So for example, one of the things that give me, my wife and I were just talking about this last night. The Trump administration's policy of ripping kids away from their parents. I still feel moral shock about that, ripping kids away from their parents and losing them. To me, that's what gives me moral shock. I lived in the Middle East at one point, and I was a student at the American University in Beirut, and I used to wind up driving by Palestinian refugee camps, and that gave me moral shock. So there's tons of things. There's tons of things that I feel ethically very passionate about. With my animal stuff, I keep that I keep that at bay. I've made a conscious or unconscious effort to I'm a speciesist in the sense that I reserve my moral shock to issues related to humans.
And you've been able to do that.
We all sort of pick our stuff, and to me, the animal stuff is a research area.
Right. Okay. So you've been able to build some kind of barrier in there to almost protect yourself from what you want to study and to keep it fun, as you say. That's interesting.
Yes. Yeah. Yes, and I guess if you ask to deal with Ken Shapiro's question, why am I not like him? Why am I not an animal activist? I've basically chosen to see this, to keep some separation between me and my research, which I think makes me a better researcher. And I know that's not true of everyone, but for me, it makes me a better researcher.
Interesting.
And I also have a strong stomach, so I can watch kids. We did studies where we watch kids dissecting. We went, watch kids, high school kids dissecting animals and interviewed the stuff. Oh, well, I slaughtered cattle. I was interested in slaughter, psychology of slaughter. So as I described in my book, I spent a couple of days working in a college slaughterhouse slaughtering cattle. It was not something I relished or I had fun doing it, but I did it. I put on my anthropology hat and I did that. Oh, by the way, when Donald Trump, when Donald Trump was running for president in 2016, I put on my anthropology hat and I went to the Trump rally when he came to town, and I wanted to see what that was like. So I viewed my work as sort of like being an anthropologist. I'm looking at it from a distance.
Interesting.
Well,
if I was an anthropologist studying, the Yanomamo in Venezuela, and they're getting ready to attack the neighboring village, I wouldn't say like, hey, no, guys, don't go do that. That would be morally wrong. It's like, no, I'm studying your world. I want to find out what your world is like. That means I got to go with you to, and so that gives me an avenue. And furthermore, here's the interesting part. That thing has been read by almost 6 million people. Yeah. And so that's a pretty big impact.
Yeah.
It's a good, so for me, writing that blog has turned out to be a good combination of stuff that's fun and stuff that does have sometimes has some impact.
Of course, you had to do a lot of publishing to get to that point where you're allowed to write that blog.
Well, I did, and the blog takes me 10 or 20 hours to write each one of those pieces because I do a lot of research for that stuff, and so it's fun, but I'm reading stuff that I want to read. Well, thanks for having me on the podcast.
That was fantastic, Hal.
Thank you.
Have a great day.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye-bye.
Well, that's all for today. Join us next time on the Anthrozoology podcast.